On the night of June 5, 1944, the coast of France was battered by a storm so ferocious that it bent the trees sideways and whipped the English Channel into a frenzy of gray, foaming waves. Inside the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, German sentries looked out into the darkness and relaxed. They knew, with absolute certainty, that no invasion force could cross the water in this weather. The tides were wrong. The wind was too high. Nature itself was guarding the Third Reich. But while the German army slept under the blanket of this false security, the greatest armada in human history was silently cutting through the waves, heading straight for them. If you are fascinated by the moments where history turns on the edge of a knife, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are about to step into bunkers of Normandy during the longest night. To understand why the German reaction was so fatally delayed, we must first understand the psychological state of the Wehrmacht command in the summer of 1944. They had been waiting for the Allied invasion for months. The tension was unbearable, but the German Meteorological Service, the Luftwaffe weather analysts, had made a critical error. They lacked the weather stations in the Atlantic that the Allies possessed. They didn't see the brief window of calm that General Eisenhower had spotted. They predicted continuous storms. This forecast was the first domino to fall. It convinced Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox and the man in charge of defending the coast, that it was safe to leave. He was exhausted. He hadn't seen his family in months. June 6 was his wife Lucy's birthday, and he had bought her a pair of gray suede shoes in Paris. Secure in the belief that the Allies wouldn't attack, he got into his staff car on June 5th and drove all the way back to Herlingen, Germany. Think about the magnitude of that decision. The one commander who possessed the energy, the tactical genius, and the authority to drive the invaders back into the sea was hundreds of miles away when the first paratroopers landed. He was effectively removing himself from the chessboard. But Rommel wasn't the only one. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, which held the Normandy sector, had ordered a map exercise, a war game, in the city of Rennes for his senior commanders. Many of the division commanders and corps commanders were away from their posts, preparing to move plastic pieces on a map, while real steel was heading for their beaches. The German command structure was fragmented and chaotic, a deliberate feature of Adolf Hitler's leadership style. Hitler didn't want any single general to have too much power, so he split the authority. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was the supreme commander in the West, an old Prussian aristocrat who despised Hitler. Rommel commanded Army Group B, but neither of them had full control. The most critical dispute was over the Panzers, the tanks. Rommel believed the invasion had to be stopped on the beach. He wanted the Panzer Division stationed right on the coast, ready to fire on the landing craft. Rundstedt believed the beaches could not be held against naval gunfire. He wanted the Panzers held back, deep inland, to launch a massive, coordinated counterattack once the Allied main effort was identified. Hitler, unable to decide, created a fatal compromise. He gave Rommel 3 Panzer divisions, gave Rundstedt none, and kept the 4 most powerful divisions, the OKW Reserve, under his personal control. These tanks, the only force capable of crushing the invasion, could not be moved without a direct order from the Führer. So, as the clock ticked past midnight on June 6, the German defense was decapitated. Rommel was in Germany. The local commanders were at a war game. The tanks were locked behind a bureaucratic wall, and the soldiers in the bunkers were watching the rain, convinced that for at least one more night, the war would stay away. They were wrong. At that very moment, thousands of C-47 transport planes were roaring overhead, carrying the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, ready to unleash chaos behind the lines. While the German High Command was paralyzed by the weather reports, another paralysis was taking hold, one born of deception. For years, the Allies had been feeding the German intelligence services a diet of lies, convincing them that the invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, and not Normandy. This deception, Operation Fortitude, was so successful that even when the real invasion began, the Germans refused to believe it. If you enjoy stories of espionage and how spies changed the course of the war, hit that like button to support our deep dives into military history. The Germans were obsessed with the Pas-de-Calais. It made logistical sense. It was the shortest route to Germany. It was where the V-1 flying bomb launch sites were located. To reinforce this belief, the Allies had created a phantom army, the first United States Army Group Fusag, commanded by the flamboyant General George Patton. They built inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, and generated fake radio traffic in southeast England, directly across from Calais. German intelligence swallowed the bait whole. They estimated that the Allies had twice as many divisions as they actually did. This meant that when the reports started coming in from Normandy, the German analysts looked at the numbers and thought, this is too small. This must be a diversion. The real blow is coming at Calais. This mindset was a filter through which every piece of information was processed in the early hours of June 6. When the first reports of paratroopers dropping in Normandy reached the headquarters of the 7th Army, the reaction was skepticism. It's just a raid, they said. They are trying to lure us away from Calais. The chaos of the airborne drops actually helped the Allied cause. Because of the heavy cloud cover and heavy anti-aircraft fire, the American and British paratroopers were scattered all over the Cherbourg Peninsula. To a disciplined German officer looking at a map, this didn't look like a focused invasion. It looked like a mess. It looked like a series of uncoordinated sabotage missions. Furthermore, the Allies dropped hundreds of Rupert dummies, small dolls with parachutes that exploded on impact to mimic rifle fire. These dummies drew German units away from the real drop zones and added to the confusion. Reports flooded of attacks everywhere, which paradoxically led the commanders to believe that nothing serious was happening anywhere. At the headquarters of the 84th Corps, General Erich Marx was perhaps the only senior commander who saw the truth. It was his birthday, too. As he celebrated quietly with his staff, the phone rang with news of the airborne landings. Marx, who had long suspected Normandy might be the target, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, the invasion has begun." But he was a lonely voice. His superiors were looking at the map of Calais, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army to move. The German radar network along the coast had been largely blinded by Allied jamming strips called window chaff. But the few stations that were still operational detected the massive fleet approaching. However, the report was so unbelievable, thousands of ships appearing out of storm, that the operators hesitated to send up the chain without verification. By the time they confirmed it, the ships were already lowering their anchors. This refusal to accept reality was the second great failure. The German military machine was built on rapid reaction, on Auftragstactik mission-type tactics. But in this instance, the machine was jammed by its own preconceived notions. They were so prepared for the invasion, they expected that they couldn't recognize the invasion that was actually happening. They were staring at the front door with their guns loaded, while the Allies were already breaking down the side window. Between the hours of 1 a.m. and 6 a.m., the fate of Europe hung in the balance. This was the critical window. The Allied troops were vulnerable, dangling in parachutes or vomiting in landing craft. If the German Panzers had moved now, under the cover of darkness, they could have been waiting on the beaches at dawn. But the Panzers did not move. They sat in their assembly areas, engines cold, crews sleeping. The reason why they didn't move is a story of fear and sycophancy. Make sure you are subscribed to our channel to understand how the culture of fear destroyed the German army. The 21st Panzer Division was the only armored unit close to the beaches. It was commanded by General Edgar Feutinger. As the reports of paratroopers came in, Feutinger realized something big was happening, but his hands were tied. He was under the command of Rommel's Army Group B, but he also had standing orders not to move without authorization. He tried to call Rommel's headquarters. Rommel was in Germany. He called his corps commander. No answer. The minutes ticked by. Feutinger knew that every minute lost was a victory for the enemy. Finally, on his own initiative, he ordered some of his tanks to move against the paratroopers. But then contradictory orders arrived. Stop. Wait. Do not commit the reserves until the main landing is confirmed. The real tragedy for the Germans lay with the Panzerlehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. These were the sledgehammers. They were positioned further inland. Their commanders, Behrlein and Witt, were ready to go. They could hear the distant rumble of the naval bombardment beginning. They called Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris, begging for the release order. Rundstedt, the old aristocrat, actually agreed. He saw that Normandy was becoming a major crisis. He ordered the tanks to prepare to move. But then his chief of staff reminded him, "Field Marshal, you cannot move the OKW reserve without the Führer's permission." Rundstedt, furious but powerless, had to call the OKW High Command of the Armed Forces, headquarters at Berchtesgaden. It was now early morning. The sun was coming up. The first waves of American troops were hitting Omaha Beach. The slaughter had begun, but the tanks that could stop them were waiting for a phone call. At Berchtesgaden, General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, took the call. Rundstedt's staff explained the situation. "The invasion is here. We need the Panzers now." Jodl refused. He was a man who owed his entire career to Hitler. He was terrified of making a mistake. "We do not know if this is the main invasion," Jodl argued. "It could be a feint. We cannot commit the reserves yet. We must wait for the Führer to decide." "Then wake him up," was a desperate plea from Paris. But Jodl wouldn't do it. Adolf Hitler had gone to bed late, around 3 a.m., after holding court with his inner circle, listening to Wagner and drinking tea. He had taken sedatives to help him sleep. His strict standing order was that he was not to be disturbed for any reason. No one in the headquarters, not Jodl, not Keitel, not his adjutants, had the courage to knock on his door. So the entire German war effort ground to a halt outside a bedroom door in the Bavarian Alps, while brave German soldiers were fighting and dying on the beaches, firing MG-42s until the barrels melted. Their supreme commander was asleep, and his generals were too terrified to wake him. The Panzers stayed parked. The opportunity to push the invasion back into the sea evaporated with the morning mist. By mid-morning on June 6th, the situation on the beaches was chaotic but stabilizing for the Allies. Omaha Beach had been a near disaster for the Americans, but they were clawing their way up the bluffs. The British and Canadians were moving inland. It was only now, around noon, that Adolf Hitler finally woke up. The reaction of the dictator to the news of the invasion was not fear, but relief. "The news couldn't be better," he declared. "Now we have them where we can destroy them." If you want to know how delusion shapes history, ensure you're subscribed to catch our next episode. Hitler finally held his daily military conference around 1 p.m., nearly 12 hours after the first Allied soldier had set foot in France. By this time, the beachheads were established. The critical moment for a counterattack at the water's edge was gone. But even now, a massive counterstroke could have been devastating. However, the ghost of the Phantom Army at Calais still haunted the room. Hitler looked at the maps. He saw the landings in Normandy, but he also saw the intelligence reports about Patton's army in England. He became convinced that Normandy was a trap. "This is the diversion," he insisted. "They want us to move our tanks south, and then they will strike at Calais." Instead of releasing all the reserves to smash the Normandy bridgehead, Hitler hesitated. He released the Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS, but he ordered them to move with caution. Worse, he refused to move the 15th Army, which was stationed at the Pas-de-Calais. This was a massive force of infantry and artillery that sat idle, watching an empty sea, while their comrades were being overrun a few hundred miles to the southwest. The order to finally release the Panzers didn't go out until late afternoon. Think about the timeline. The invasion began at 0:15. The tanks didn't get the official go order until roughly 1600 hours. That is a 16-hour delay in a battle where minutes decided life or death. When the order finally reached the Panzer divisions, the commanders were apoplectic with rage. They had spent the entire day sitting under camouflage nets, listening to the battle raging in the distance. They had wasted the overcast morning hours when they could have moved without fear of air attack. Now, they were being told to move in the late afternoon, just as the clouds were breaking. This decision, or rather, this indecision, was the final nail in the coffin of the Atlantic Wall. It highlighted the fundamental flaw of the Nazi regime. It was a system where initiative was punished and obedience was paralyzed by fear. A corporal on the beach could see what was happening, but the field marshal in the headquarters wasn't allowed to act on it. Hitler's belief that he was a military genius combined with the surrounding echo chamber of sycophants, meant that reality couldn't penetrate the wolf's lair until it was too late. He was fighting a war on a map that existed only in his head, a map where he could trap the Allies. In the real world, the Allies were breaking out, and the window to stop them had closed while he drank his morning tea. When the German Panzer columns finally revved their engines and began to roll toward Normandy in the late afternoon of June 6, they looked up and saw the sky turn black, not with storm clouds, but with aircraft. The Allies had total air superiority. This was the final, brutal consequence of the delay. By waiting until weather cleared and the day was advanced, the Germans marched straight into a slaughter. Don't forget to click subscribe to see how air power changed the face of warfare forever. The Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, were prowling the skies. They were the J-Bo's Jag bomber, and they terrified the German tankers more than anything else. As soon as a German column appeared on a road, the J-Bo's would dive. They fired rockets that could crack a Tiger tank open like a tin can. They strafed supply trucks, turning them into fireballs. General Bayerlein of the Panzer Division described the march to the front as a witch's cauldron. He lost dozens of tanks and trucks before he even saw an enemy soldier. The delay meant that instead of arriving at the front as a cohesive fighting force, the German divisions arrived piecemeal, battered, and exhausted. They had to hide in the woods during the day and only move at night. This destroyed their ability to launch a coordinated counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division, which had managed to attack earlier in the day, actually reached the sea between the British and Canadian beaches. They drove a wedge right to the water. It was a glimpse of what could have happened if the other divisions had been there to support them. But the 21st was alone. They looked left and right, saw no support, saw the massive Allied fleet offshore turning its guns toward them, and were forced to retreat. If the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr had been there to support the 21st at that moment, they might have split the Allied beachhead in two. But they were miles away, burning on the side of the road under relentless air attack. The delay also allowed the Allies to bring their own heavy armor ashore. By the evening of June 6th, Sherman tanks were moving inland. Anti-tank guns were dug in. The fragile crust of the beachhead was hardening into a concrete wall. The Germans had missed the golden hour. In the headquarters, the mood shifted from arrogance to panic. Rommel finally arrived back at his headquarters late that night, after a desperate high-speed drive from Germany. When he looked at the map, he knew the battle was lost. He knew that once the Allies were established on shore, with their air power and their logistics, Germany could not win. The only chance had been to push them back into the water in the first 24 hours. Rommel reportedly said to his aide, "If we don't succeed in the first 48 hours, the war is lost." As he looked at the positions of his panzers, scattered, delayed, held back by Hitler, he realized that the 48 hours were almost up, and they hadn't even begun to fight properly. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the longest day came to an end. The Allies had landed over 150,000 men. They had suffered grievous casualties, particularly at Omaha Beach, but they held the ground. The Atlantic Wall was breached. For the German High Command, the night brought a terrifying realization. The nightmare scenario was real. We are reaching the end of this tragedy of errors. So verify you are subscribed to follow the collapse of the Third Reich in our future videos. The failure to react in time on D-Day was not just a tactical error. It was a symptom of a dying system. It proved that the German army, for all its tactical brilliance and superior weaponry, was strategically brain dead. The centralization of power in Hitler's hands meant that the nervous system of the army was severed. The hand couldn't move because the brain was asleep, literally and metaphorically. In the days that followed, the Germans would fight with desperate ferocity. The Battle of Normandy would drag on for months. The hedgerows would be stained with blood. But the strategic outcome had been decided on day one. The Germans were forced into a war of attrition, throwing their units into the line one by one to plug gaps, rather than massing them for a decisive blow. Hitler continued to hold back the 15th Army at Calais for weeks, still believing the real invasion was coming. By the time he realized the truth, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing toward Paris. That delay, born of the deception plan and Hitler's stubbornness, cost Germany the war in the West. Historians often ask, what if? What if Rommel had been there? What if the Panzers had been released at 2 a.m.? It is likely that the invasion would have still succeeded eventually, due to the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies. But on that specific day, it could have been a disaster. Eisenhower had drafted a letter accepting responsibility for the failure of the landings. He kept it in his pocket. He never had to use it, thanks to the German paralysis. The story of the German reaction to D-Day is a lesson in command. It teaches us that time is the most precious resource in war. It teaches us that a rigid chain of command, ruled by fear, will always shatter against a flexible enemy. And it teaches us that the course of history can indeed be changed by a single man taking a sleeping pill while the world burns. The defeat of Germany became inevitable not when the first American boot hit the sand, but when the first German tank failed to turn its key. The reaction came too late, and the price was paid in the complete destruction of the Third Reich. Thank you for watching this deep dive into failure of the German command on D-Day. If you want to see the perspective of the soldiers who stormed the beaches, click the video on your screen now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history.